I'd like to pray the words out of Psalm 19:14. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Well, as promised at the beginning of the service by Pastor Bob, we're launching into a sermon series here this summer called H20, and you can see it's a water theme, but it also stands for Heroes to Outcasts. And so we're going to look at some biblical figures with ties to water and ties into being outcasts and how God used them and saved them. And this morning, we're going to look at a very familiar person from the Old Testament named Noah. We just heard a little bit about Noah from that reading out of Hebrews chapter 11, and I know some of you are saying, well, wait a minute, Hebrews, that's in the New Testament. I thought Noah was a story out of the Old Testament, and you'd be right. If you flip the very first book of the Bible, Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 is where you read this account about this guy named Noah. Well, what Genesis 6 explains is how God is so disgusted at mankind. Mankind is so evil that he can't take it anymore and says, I am going to wipe every living creature, man, birds, animals, I'm wiping them off the face of the earth. I can't take it anymore. Now let's go back to January, and Pastor Bob pondered out loud, how in the world are Noah's Ark toys the number one gift given to little children? And I have done that with my own two grandchildren. Here, Clara and Austin, God was so mad at the world that he was going to drown everyone. So Granddad's bought you some little toys to remember that by. And so the Buuck household has Noah's Ark coloring books. We've got Noah's Ark's puzzles. We've got Noah's Ark's Tupperware floaty toys in my bathtub. We even have the overpriced actual wood Noah's Ark set in our house. And at first blush, it seems like a little bit of an odd gift to give to a kid. Back to Genesis 6. Verse 8, after all that, we see these two wonderful words that simply say, but Noah. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. In the midst of this dismal proclamation by God that he's going to wipe mankind and every living creature off the face of the earth, we find this guy named Noah. Noah gives us some hope. Noah reminds us that God has not forgotten about his promise to redeem humanity. Back in Genesis 3:15, God promised after that first sin, I'm going to solve this problem. And his solution is Noah. And frankly, you and I are sitting here today solely because of Noah's faith in God, that God saved him, Mrs. Noah, his 3 kids, and their wives, those 8 people. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord because of his faith in God. There was one guy who stood out among the crowd. In an unrighteous world back then, there was one guy who was righteous. In a world that dismissed God entirely, he walked with God. The criticism of his friends and neighbors didn't stop him, or if it did bother him, I should say, it didn't stop him. And God took notice that Noah stood his ground. So chapter 6 ends with God giving Noah these directions on how to build the ark and how to get your wife and kids and their spouses onto the ark. And true to form, verse 22 says, Noah did everything just as God commanded. So again, we see Noah's faithfulness and his obedience toward God in action. Well, chapter 7 then talks about how the springs of the earth just burst forth, and here came all this water, and it poured down rain from the heavens as well. For 40 days, it just flooded. It says the flood lasted about 150 days. Verse 22 then gives us the bad news at the conclusion of the flood. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark. Chapter 8, earth has been flooded for 150 days, and Noah wants to see if the flood's receded. He ultimately sends a dove out. The dove comes back with an olive branch in its mouth, and Noah says, aha, the waters must be receding because this bird has a piece of tree in its mouth. And so he tells his Mrs. Noah, the 3 kids, their wives, and all the animals to get off the ark. They disembark because the floodwaters has succeeded. And what does Noah do? He gets off the ark. He builds an altar. He takes 2 clean animals and he sacrifices to God in gratefulness and in thankfulness for saving them. And then in chapter 9, God tells Noah and the kids, hey, go out and be fruitful and multiply. Let's repopulate the earth here. We're going to start all over again. He promises them that covenant, that rainbow. He says, Noah, you and those people sitting at the 9:30 service at Faith Community someday, whenever you folks see a rainbow, be reminded of this promise I'm making you, that never again will I flood the earth. And so hopefully when you see a rainbow, and we'll probably see some coming up here as monsoon season gets going, when you see that, you're reminded of God's love and his faithfulness. So maybe giving Noah's Ark toys isn't such a bad idea for kids after all. As we see God's love and grace in action, I think I'm just trying to alleviate some of my own guilt from giving my grandkids those things. By the way, if you don't know this, I would suggest to you that about 5 miles from here, as the crow flies, to drive is probably 10, just northwest of here, I took this picture up there. It's on Fossil Ridge. Pastor Bo took me up there a few years ago. It's a 10-minute hike. You don't have to be in great athletic shape to get up there. There are all kinds of seashell fossils up there. So if you've ever doubted that there's no way this desert could have possibly been, flooded, I submit to you 5 miles from here, you'll see a ton of sea sponge fossils and all kinds of shell fossils up there. Well, if our theme is H20, heaven to outcast, what does this have to do with Noah? I think it's probably obvious, the H2O part, right? The two hydrogen molecules and the oxygen. There's a ton of water in this story. But what about this heaven to outcast? Well, Matt even mentioned it in his children's message. It probably doesn't take a huge stretch of one's imagination to realize the ridicule that Noah would have suffered from his neighbors back then with this massive ark he was building. If you go to Answers in Genesis, I like to go there. There's some things about the science piece of this that I don't totally understand. It speaks with clarity that Noah probably spent between 55 years and 75 years building this ark in his backyard. So there were plenty of time for people to stop by, to question him, to laugh at him, to mock him about what he was doing. This was not some little pontoon boat in his backyard. I mean, this is a football field and a half long, right? I mean, this is a massive structure, 45 to 55 feet high, 75 to 85 feet wide. This is a massive structure. I mean, heck, can you imagine the fine from his HOA back then for building this thing? I mean, heck, my neighbors get mad if I have like leaves in my grass, and here's this guy is building this massive boat in the middle of the desert. So he was outcast socially. Number one, what are you building a boat for in the desert? But more importantly, we know because the generation was so wicked that they're like, God, how stupid can you be that you would actually believe that there's a God? And so Noah is a true social outcast in every sense of the word. Well, thankfully, heaven comes to outcasts, and God saved him. Sometimes it's good not to be in the in crowd. Sometimes the least actually does become the greatest. In the account of the flood, we get this glimpse of what heaven's going to be like. The ark is kind of a microcosm of the world, right? Because in heaven, you're going to see faithful people like you folks and like Noah, who made it through something really treacherous called God's wrath, who made it through, who stayed true, who stayed the course and stayed faithful and believed. Let's put Hebrews 11 in context. You heard that read for us just a little bit ago. I suppose Hebrews 11 is called the Heroes of the Faith chapter. It might, if you're an athlete, you might call it the Hall of Fame, kind of the biblical Hall of Fame. What happens in Hebrews 11 is the writer of the book of Hebrews is writing to the Hebrews who were former Jews who have become Christians, but they're tired, they're just getting worn down, they're being ridiculed, they're getting mocked, and they're starting to ask themselves, is it really worth being a Christian anymore? And so what the writer of the Hebrews tries to do is give them this pep talk, this inspirational chat about, let me tell you about some people who have gone before you, who were also ridiculed, who were also mocked, who also are getting worn down and tired. And I want to remind you of their faith in hopes, perhaps, to inspire you to hang in there. So he's encouraging them to stay faithful. And in verse 7, he talks about Noah. And he says these words, "By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith." And that's what you and I are being get to. The writer of the Hebrews is also encouraging us to stay the task, stay the course, hang in there. It's going to be worth it in the end. The unsinkable faith of Captain Noah brought heaven to that outcast, and our faith, even as we worship here this morning, is going to bring us to become heirs of righteousness as well, and it's going to be worth it. Have you ever felt like an outcast because of your faith? Have you ever felt like an outcast because of your faith? I got news for you. The world ridicules us that we believe in God. The world ridicules us that we believe that his son actually came down in the form of a man, lived a perfect life, suffered, died, and then rose again from the dead. The world ridicules that. The world ridicules the fact that we believe that God created the world. This country's and this world's universities do not teach that God created the world. They mock you and me for believing such nonsense in their eyes. The world ridicules us because the whole concept of Christianity seems so unbelievable. I went to urbandictionary.com to get their definition of Christians, and this is what they write. Christianity is the belief that a cosmic Jewish zombie who is his own father can make you live forever if you symbolically eat his flesh and telepathically tell him that you accept him as your master, so he can remove an evil force from your soul that is present in humanity because a rib woman was convinced by a talking snake to eat from a magical tree. That's what the world thinks of us. We are outcasts. They think we're crazy. And this is how they define our belief in Jesus. To so many, there are so many outcasts that I would say to you, welcome to the club. You're not alone. There are many of us outcasts who believe this. The Bible's full of them. Noah's a great example of being an outcast, despite the ridicule that he faced. But let's be clear, Noah was an outcast in another way as well. I would just summarize the end of chapter 9 where he gets drunk and naked, that Noah also had a sin problem. Noah was a righteous guy, and his faith saved him through the flood, and that saved him from an earthly death. But Noah had also this disease of sin and needed to be saved by what Christ accomplished for him on the cross. And so it was his belief in God's love for him that ultimately saved him as a spiritual outcast. And if you and I are honest with each other, even though we might say, well, you know, Doc, there's 2.2 million people in Las Vegas. There are 183 of us that got off St. Mattress to actually come to church this morning. I could have been hanging out doing something different, working on my tan, swimming, We're pretty darn good people, but the reality is when you align yourself and stack yourself up to a perfect and holy and just God, we all fall way short of perfection. And we are spiritual outcasts and need the same redemptive grace that Christ accomplished for us on the cross to save us just as he did for Noah. 1 Peter 3 compares Noah's ark and going through the water to our baptisms, to what we do right here at this font. 1 Peter 3:18-21 reads this way, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, Noah, Mrs. Noah, the 3 kids and their wives, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ." The water saved Noah as it washed away the evils of that generation and left Noah there, washing away that dirt and the filth that was so angering God. Just as at the fount of baptism, that water doesn't wash the dirt and the grease off my face. It washes me clean. It makes me a member of God's family. And so God in 1 Peter inspired the writer to make this connection between just as God brought Noah from death to life through the water, so at the fount of baptism, with simple water combined with God's word, washes us clean as well and brings us from death to life through this water. The good news of the gospel comforts outcasts like you and me, because God has always been in the sin removal business. That's always been his mission, and that remains his mission today. Throughout his ministry on earth, Jesus sought the outcasts. If you read through the scriptures, those are the people that he hung out with. The women, the children, the orphan, the foreigners, the people, the sick, the lepers, and most importantly, yes, the sinners. Jesus came for the outcasts. So he came for you and for me through his sacrificial death and resurrection. I'll close with this. I found it interesting that in an ark that massive, there was one door. Genesis 6:16 says that there was one way in to the ark. There was one way to get to that which was going to save you. It was a single door. Noah, Mrs. Noah, the 3 kids and the wives all went through it. Every single creature that survived went through one door. Well, Jesus makes 7 I am statements throughout the Gospels. And one of them, he says in John 10:19, I am the door. He doesn't say I am one of the doors, I am a door. He says, I am the door. I am the one way to be saved. Just like there was one way to get onto that ark. He speaks with even more piercing clarity in John 14:6 when he says, I'm the way, the truth, and the light, and no one is coming to the Father except through me, the door. So just as heaven came to the outcast Noah, heaven also comes to us as outcasts as well. In Noah's day, grace came in the form of an ark. Today, grace comes in the form of a cross. Thank God, heaven does indeed come to outcasts. Amen.